All right, well, we're here with Jason Hill of the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering. And Jason's going to be talking to us today about our topic of communicating science to the public, and particularly to policy-making audiences, as well as questions of risk. And Jason's main area of research recently has been ethanol. And so maybe, Jason, tell us a little bit about your research, your work.
So there's a lot of interest in using ethanol as a replacement for current fossil fuels, oil really, using ethanol as a fuel to replace the gasoline that we use to drive ourselves to and from work and to and from fun activities day to day. And we use a lot of gasoline in the world. In the US alone, we use about 150 billion gallons a year. And so anything we can do to lessen that amount is helpful. So we've looked at ways of increasing efficiency of vehicles, but we also need other fuels if we're really going to make a serious dent in our gasoline use. So one of the things that has been proposed and is actually being implemented is the use of ethanol. Ethanol which can be used blended with gasoline and used in cars that we have today. And we're doing that today. We're producing about 15 billion gallons of ethanol and are blending that into our gasoline supply and are using that to drive from place to place.
Excellent. And I know in terms of policy, there's been various controversies in the issue of ethanol, and that as a scientist that studies these issues, what sorts of controversies have there been? What sort of issues are at play when you're in a public forum discussing ethanol?
Yeah, so we're all very familiar with the risks of gasoline, right? So there's a risk always when we're drilling that it's going to spill and have an Exxon Valdez or Gulf, the Deepwater Horizon type of incidents. And we know that it contributes to climate change and other sort of pollution that affects human health and well-being. But there are also risks to ethanol. And there is a real risk of using something that we use for food for fuel. And that can raise the prices of food, and that can be hard on those who are less able to afford food than others, especially. But there are also environmental risks. Corn farming, which is the overwhelmingly large amount of ethanol we produce is from corn. Corn farming is also environmentally damaging. We use large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides, and we have to plow up land that might otherwise be supporting a lot of biodiversity to produce corn. So we have to weigh those risks against one another.
And so when you're presenting your research, for example, in a public hearing, or for that matter, a congressional hearing, maybe you can even tell us about that experience. What are some of the things that you keep in mind, both on the sort of meta level of here's how I'm going to present this information, but even in terms of your topic? I mean, there are so many issues there, from subsidies to the mathematics of the issue, that you have to be cognizant of it when you're describing this. Maybe tell us a little bit about that experience and some of the things that you use as guideposts to how you're going to present that information.
Okay, so I present my work to all sorts of audiences. I present it to academic audiences, to the public. A lot of public groups are interested in knowing more about this issue. And then I have the opportunity to work with policymakers sometimes. Earlier this year, in end of July, I was asked to testify before the U.S. House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology on the issue of the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is the law in the Energy Independence and Security Act that requires the increased use of ethanol. So what do I do when I prepare for these different audiences? I try to put the issue in context, which is somewhat what I've done with you here. Is I haven't just launched into ethanol's good, ethanol's bad.
Right.
I tried to say here's why we care about this issue, because we use a lot of gasoline, because we know that's damaging, and so what alternatives do we have? So I try to introduce that, and then I also try to make sure that I'm telling the story of why we care about this and what sort of analysis that we do to understand the problem. So I can tell a bit of that story now. I work in an area called life cycle assessment, where we look at all the effects of producing and using different fuel options. So we don't care, we need to care more than about what just happens from the pollution that's emitted in the tailpipes of vehicles. We need to look at what happens when growing corn or drilling for oil or transporting those fuels to their end use. So I try to tell that story to people to help them realize that this is something that they can understand. It's not just scientists coming up with these numbers and feeding them to them, but it's something that they intuitively know. They know that oil comes from the ground, and they know that it's extracted and it travels, perhaps by tanker or pipeline to a refinery, because they've probably driven by a refinery. So I try to link this story together for them. People may be less familiar with where corn comes from. Maybe not. But it grows in fields, and you need fertilizers, which are produced in different places, and you need fuel to run those tractors and transport the corn and convert it to ethanol. And so we tell that story, and so we try I try to bring that to the audience to help them feel comfortable that this is something that they too could do. The other thing I always try to tell these audiences is that the information that we use in our analyses are publicly available. They're available to anybody else in the world who would want to, including them, who would want to check the sources and run the analyses themselves, and perhaps even test different things. I think that's some of the strength of our work, is that it's not bound by non-disclosure agreements or proprietary information. That it's open and anybody else can
be
recreate.
replicated.
That can be replicated by others.
Yeah. Well, I'm fascinated. I think you've done a wonderful job of laying out sort of how both go together, that sort of need for narrative, the more humanistic, if you will, that's how we communicate, but also the importance of good, solid science, and in terms of the communication, having the facts and figures from the research and being able to explain that. One thing that you made me think of as you're talking about that is that we can picture one doing that at a congressional hearing now, and we'd love to hear more about that specific experience, even if you'd share, but also a public audience. But I've even found among scientists that other than sharing perhaps those core sets of courses, calculus, physics, whatever, that really at a certain point with specialization, even across scientific boundaries, you probably find yourself having to really translate a lot of what you're talking about. And does narrative help in that domain as well?
It definitely helps in that translation. So you can imagine my field, that draws together from many other fields. We have to know something about economics and chemistry and engineering and sociology. All those come together in the sorts of
product supply chain. I mean, it's just,
I talk to faculty from all over the university all the time, because we need to know more about these specific angles, because we're not stuck in a laboratory, working on one small product. We're working on issues. Entire systems that have to be designed and run, and there are laws backing them, and there are economic realities at play, and there's consumer choice, and all these things come together when we're talking about tackling these issues that are important to the world. So the congressional hearing was certainly a wonderful experience for me to be able to communicate the findings of my work to policymakers, to people who actually can do something about making changes at a very grand scale. And this was a hearing on the renewable fuel standard, which is, your students can certainly look up, Google renewable fuel standard, which mandates increasing amounts of biofuels be produced in the U.S. Year after year. And so Congress, this committee has oversight authority to understand whether this law is indeed having its intended effects. Or what are its intended effects? To increase U.S. energy security and to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And at the same time, reduce the impact on human health from other pollutants that contribute to particulate matter and ozone, and to have other environmental benefits. Well, My research has shown that corn ethanol, as it's produced today, is more damaging to human health from the air pollution of the formation of particulate matter and ozone than gasoline. Now, this goes counter to what was hoped by these type of rules, and that's because a lot of the focus had been on what was happening in vehicle tailpipes, not on what goes into producing these fuels. So I was asked to testify as a witness for the majority, and I was given an opportunity to prepare a written statement and submit that written statement in advance, and then to read that statement, and then to undergo a couple rounds of questioning. And this is you're under oath. You're required to you must tell the truth in this, and the whole truth and nothing but the truth in these sorts of hearings. And so rather than let that intimidate me, which it never should to a scientist, because you always should be telling the truth, right?
Yeah.
You should be doing your best work.
Yet that level of scrutiny is not on us all the time.
Well, no, but somewhat
it should be, but it's not officially.
Not officially, but as scientists, we should always be telling the truth in what we do and the findings of our work and our best of our knowledge, and not go beyond what we actually know. To say, I don't know that, but I can look that up for you if you're interested, or I can put you in touch with somebody.
Or at what point does one simplify enough to explain something, but then oversimplify and therefore get rid of the nuance or complexity that's more true?
Exactly.
It's a question of parsimony, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. And you're not given a lot of time to talk about this either.
Yeah.
You have a very short amount of time to get your main points across. So you practice, in advance. Your friends ask you some questions, some tough questions, and you watch some other hearings beforehand to know what to expect, and then you go in there and answer the questions. And it's an exciting process, and it's good to see that. In a democracy, we have that opportunity to contribute to the public dialogue. I mean, that's it's one thing to do the science; it's another to really get your message out there and to have it be widely known.
Yeah, and you've just presented excellent advice as far as the interpretive talks that the students are going to do. We have everything from STEM majors to artists in this course who are having to get up and do a public presentation, and that was some of the best advice I've heard yet as far as how to do it, practicing, having a model.
Yeah, practice.
Yeah. And I guess I want to ask you maybe two more questions. The first one is a little bit of a statement, but Robert Cox, who's the primary author of our text, talks a lot about, and by the way, I don't know if you know who Robert Cox was. He was the president of the Sierra Club. He talks a lot about the primary audience versus the secondary audience. And some people have even criticized him for going too far, but so often out there we kind of assume we educate a public, the public does something and something happens, whereas Cox points out it rarely or doesn't necessarily work that way, especially in the short term. When you get to talk to a primary audience, such as congressional policymakers, it's an incredible opportunity that you had in order to do that. So I think that's really exciting. The question that I would have for you in part is, given that so many of us, I think it's not just a policymaker or a farmer, et cetera, or to use the example of a farmer who gets a certain crop value, acre value, based on the fact that there are subsidies or whatever. Is that something you're cognizant of when you're talking to people, is thinking about them as the people you're talking to, that there are a certain set of interests they have that you need to sort of negotiate or discuss this information with? And how does that work?
Yeah, so, I always try to tailor my message to whatever audience I'm talking about. The message itself, doesn't change. It's our findings, and that shouldn't change depending on the audience. But I may offer more background to some audiences versus others, or I may try to pull in other points that may be relevant to them. Or sometimes, I'll say things more forcefully to one audience than others. Not to say that I'm pulling punches, but some audiences may respond better to certain ways of presenting information than others. And so try to be cognizant of that when I'm talking.
Yeah, excellent. Well, my last question is going to involve risk communication.
Okay.
You've already implicitly talked about it a little bit, but when it comes to ethanol or any issue you've studied or been involved in, what are some of the ways in which you can communicate risk? It seems like when you've already talked about that balancing act between how simplified do you present it in a narrative and yet still worry about being true to the complexities and nuance of the science. I would think with areas of risk it becomes even more heightened in some ways, yet at some times there has to be that element of a little bit of alarm. I don't know. How does risk communication fit into what you do, and do you have any recommendations as far as how one would go about communicating issues of risk?
Sure. So one thing that I try to do when communicating risk is, I mean, I could talk about statistics of, type 1 error versus type 2 error and so forth, which probably wouldn't, a lot of audiences wouldn't relate to very well. But what I try to do is try to tell, again, a story of something they can relate to. So I often say, well, ethanol is a drug, right? I mean, we know that. We treat it like a drug. There are drug treatment programs for ethanol abuse, for instance. It's alcohol. And so, well, let's talk about drugs. What happens when testing drugs? So in this analogy, I'm going to say, well, the ailment is dependence on oil, and we're looking for a cure, which is ethanol. So that's something already an audience can relate to, right? Well, how do you go about testing the cure? Well, the way you do it in drug trials is, first of all, even before establishing whether or not the drug has its intended effect, you have to establish whether it's more harmful than your current gold standard, right? And only once you've established in a large population that your proposed drug, your trial drug, isn't any worse than doing nothing or your current standard, then you look at the efficacy of that drug. And then I say to the audiences, well, what have we done with ethanol? We've kind of done it backwards. We've assumed that it has these benefits, and then we've produced it in large volumes, and now we're looking at all the side effects, if you will. Whereas what we should have done was, first of all said, is it worse than just doing nothing, or other options we have, the gold standard in essence, using less, for instance, conservation and efficiency, and only then, once we answered that, yes, it is no more harmful than doing nothing or these other things, then we could say, is it really having its intended effect? So I try to turn that question into something that people can relate to.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I think people can understand, for example, the precautionary principle when it comes to health. Sometimes we have a harder time understanding it in something more abstract like an ecosystem. And it seems like one of the things that, I'm not going to say it's completely new, but sort of we're becoming more aware of, is the way in which certain ways of mitigating environmental problems can in themselves be an issue, geoengineering, and in this case with ethanol, that the assumed good has to also be scrutinized. So that sounds like something you've been at the heart of.
Yeah, no, it's a great place to be because we want to do something. We know that our current human activities are having a very large negative impact on the world and on other people, and so we need to try out all these different things. But we also need to try them out in a way that is, takes the precautions that we really should take when going down those different pathways.
Sure, makes sense. Well, Jason Hill, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.